Hello, everyone that's watching us. Hello, Manuel, that's joining us
Hello.
from Madrid. He's originally from Portugal, but he's living right now in Madrid. Um, it's a pleasure to be here with you, and thank you all for joining us from wherever you're coming. Today's session it's from Manuel Pais. He's a professional tech trainer, and he's also co-author of the book Team Topologies. And today's session is Kubernetes is not your platform, it's just the foundation. It's my pleasure to present you and to introduce you to Manuel Pais. Um, just a reminder that this is Tech Community Days by the community for the community, and the communities involved in all of the organization. It's Guatemala SQL Server Group, Microsoft Dev Group, Docker Guatemala, and Kubernetes Guatemala. This is our social networks. Please scan the QR code so that you can follow us in our webpage, and you can follow us in Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. Uh, we will be answering questions in the comment section in the YouTube live, but also if you can join via our Slack channel, I will post the Slack channel in the in the comment section. So you can post the live questions that you want to ask Manuel in the live section. So without any more to say, I'll leave you with Manuel Pais and his session.
Hola, Marcos. Gracias. Thanks for inviting me for this conference, and great job putting up this lineup. And so it's a pleasure to share with you. I'm glad the time zone works because it's 6 p.m. for me. So yeah, I'm going to talk about Kubernetes and whether if it's really a platform or if it's just a foundation. And you might guess it depends on how you define a platform, right? But so what I see, I mean, Kubernetes has created a very interesting transformation in many organizations, and we see a lot of really good articles around kind of the technical approach and how different organizations are implementing it. But I don't often see a lot about how are the teams set up that are, responsible for Kubernetes. What are the teams that are using Kubernetes in the organization? And to me, I always see technology, the success of technology or the adoption of technology is very dependent on the teams that we set up and how they interact, right? So as Marcos mentioned, I'm one of the co-authors with Matthew Skelton of the book Team Topologies around organizing business and technology teams for fast flow. So the book came out last year from the IT Revolution Press, who also published the Phoenix Project, the Unicorn Project, DevOps Handbook, and so on. And we focus a lot on different types of teams and making clear the interactions between teams. Because, like I said, I think that's critical to actually succeed with technology. And today we're talking a lot about technology and practices and so on, but we also need to think about the team setup. So this is the agenda I'll be covering today. And so let's start with a question. Is Kubernetes a platform? So let me, before I tell you my definition or our definition of platform in the book, let me tell you a little story. So back in March last year, 2019, I saw this great talk from Melanie Cebula, who works at Airbnb infrastructure team. And she was talking at QCon London about how they essentially created some very kind of simple to use tools for their development teams. So they have about more than 1,000 engineers, or they had at least in 2019. Of course, now the situation might be different. And so they adopted Kubernetes, but they realized they needed to simplify the workflow so that it was actually usable by this all these development teams. Because with 1,000 engineers, you can expect they're very different kind of backgrounds, very different experience levels. And And I wrote a story because I'm also DevOps editor at InfoQ. I wrote a story about this talk, and it just kind of went viral. So it had 20,000 views in a week, in the first week of publication, which is way beyond the average. And so I think this resonates with a lot of people, even still today. The fact that, yes, Kubernetes is very useful in many aspects, but it requires a long learning curve, and especially for people who are not experienced. And so the fact that they were talking about how to simplify these interactions and this workflow resonated with a lot of people, I think. And we know that Kubernetes provides help with reducing the complexity of running microservices, or macroservices, or whatever you want to call it, but it helps us kind of decouple our architectures and scale easier, and all this kind of great functionality. And it also helps more on the development side to start talking about kind of higher level abstractions in terms of deployments and services, and we're not always talking about kind of the infrastructure resources level. So this is all very useful, obviously, and this is part of the reason why Kubernetes became so successful and effectively kind of won the war, right, around container platforms. But there's still a lot that you need to do if you adopt this technology. You need to think about what is the size of the hosts, how do we and when do we create and destroy clusters, updating to new Kubernetes versions. Do we use namespaces to isolate services and environments or clusters, etc.? I mean, if you are working directly with Kubernetes administration, I'm sure you can think of a lot more, a lot of other tasks, and you could include here. Another frequent one is worrying about security as well. But kind of what I'm trying to say is that we need clarity on who is the provider of the Kubernetes platform, if you like, and who is the consumer in our organization, who is going to be affected if we make changes to the platform. And so if we don't have clarity on this to start with, then we're probably going to run into a lot of challenges and a lot of problems where teams were affected that didn't expect to be. And so that's kind of the first step, right? It's complicated. It's not always easy to have that clear boundaries between who owns the what parts of the platform and who consumes it. So I think, like I said, having a common definition of a modern platform is important. I like this definition from Evan Butcher. He works at ThoughtWorks in Australia, and he talks about the digital platform as a foundation of self-service APIs, tools, and services, but also the knowledge and support, and everything arranged as a compelling internal product. So there's a lot kind of packed in this definition. Some of the keywords I want to highlight. He talks about it being the foundation of these self-service capabilities, but also the support. So I think that gives a hint to why Kubernetes is a foundation. You need the support, you need the teams around it to actually make that technology usable inside the organization without these huge learning curves and difficulties that many development teams face. And the last part is also very important, a compelling product. So what does this mean? Well, if it's compelling, it means it's not mandatory. We're not imposing this platform on all of our teams. It should provide and should have clear value for the development teams to adopt it and to decide, yes, there are benefits in adopting this platform, whether it's based on Kubernetes or not. And so I have the autonomy to decide to use the platform. And also, if we think about it, a platform as a product, that kind of changes a lot of the mindset, and it moves us away from the kind of typical platform that at least I found when I started in the industry 20 years ago, where platforms were mostly kind of black boxes, kind of this magic inside that we didn't really know what was happening, but the organization was saying, well, everyone has to use the platform. And often that caused more difficulties than the benefits it provided, because the teams were forced to use it. They didn't always understand how to use it well. The support was not always as good as it should be. While if it's a product and if it's not mandatory, this is going to force us to have a mindset in the platform as, these are our users. We need to understand the users. We need to understand their needs, and we need to make the platform product, available and easy to adopt. So finally, that's why I say the title of the talk is Kubernetes is not your platform. It's just the foundation. It's a great foundation. There's amazing set of functionality and all the things it allows us to do in an easier way, but you still need to think about it as kind of the foundation to build on top of. So you always need this kind of internal platform. And it might not be a very thick internal platform, meaning you might not need a lot on top of Kubernetes, but you probably need some kind of abstractions and some kind of layers that help the development teams understand what they need from the platform and how they should use it. In other words, as Evan Butch was saying, you want to create a path of least resistance, make the right thing to do, the easy thing to do. So that should be the goal of the platform. Not to mandate, not to impose, but actually here's a set of services that you can use that make your life easier as a development team. And kind of one of the hard things about platform is we need to constantly evolve it and adapt to new and old customers. So especially the larger the organization, the more you're going to have different teams with different experience levels, maturity, and also their needs keep evolving over time. And so from a platform point of view, you need to expect that and to expect regular collaboration with different teams, understanding how the services need to evolve. So the reason for this picture is that Kubernetes is a little bit like an elephant, right? It's not something that it's, a small tool or, some piece of technology you can integrate easily with the rest. It's kind of, you have to take the whole elephant in the house. And so we need to be careful also around the team dynamics, right? So we don't want to fall into this trap. Remember, DevOps came about because we had this gap between development operations teams. And what you don't want to do is that now you still have this gap, but you have the cool name that the operations team is not Kubernetes team. So that's not the idea of a platform, and it's not it's something we should be wary of and avoid. Another important concept, besides the definition of what a platform really is thinking about team cognitive load. So cognitive load is the total amount of mental effort being used in the working memory. So this is a definition from the 80s by a psychologist, John Sweller. So it's not specific to technology, but in general, at kind of individual level. But the interesting thing is that we can think about cognitive load as a team, and also that cognitive load has different aspects to it. So there's intrinsic cognitive load, which means, imagine I'm a part of a software delivery team working in some Java service. If I don't know how to define a class in Java, that's going to take up some space in my memory. So that's intrinsic cognitive load. And perhaps because, I don't know, I was away, I was on holidays, or I was away for 6 months, and now I don't remember how to write the classes, whatever it might be. It's just going to take up some space in my memory. Extraneous cognitive load is when we have to think and we have to take space in our working memory to execute some tasks that are needed to deploy our changes, to deploy the kind of the business solutions that we're trying to bring to our customers. And anything that is kind of focus on the mechanics. How do I deploy this application, or how do I configure the application? How do I access the test environment? How do I run the end-to-end tests? All the sorts of activities. If we have to kind of every time think about it and remember how to do them, this is going to take cognitive load, effort. In this case, it's extraneous cognitive load. And finally, germane cognitive load is everything that's related to the business domain. So for example, if I'm working in a banking application, I probably need to know how bank transfers work, and a lot more information and about the kind of business domain. Kind of you can kind of associate this with intrinsic cognitive load around the skills that we need to do the work, extraneous around the mechanics, the things that need to happen to deliver the work, and germane around everything related to the business domain and the problems that we're trying to solve for the business. And we can think about this knowing that there's a limit to the cognitive capacity of any team. Then we want to minimize the intrinsic cognitive load. So there are many ways we can do that that we know about, either classical training or mentoring, with pairing senior engineers with more junior engineers, or pair programming, mob programming, code reviews. All of these help reduce intrinsic cognitive load and are very, very helpful. And on the extraneous cognitive load, it's where we don't always have the best approaches to reduce this, but we would like to minimize them, right? So that we reserve as much as possible space in our working memory to focus on germane and to be thinking about the business parts of the problem. So if you're interested in knowing more about cognitive load, there's a great talk from Joe Pierce called Hacking Your Head, and also other resources around that. But kind of the key takeaway in the context of this talk is that to be mindful of the choices you make around the platform, because they might have a strong impact on the development teams or application teams' cognitive load, especially the extraneous one. So if we, for example, adopt Kubernetes in our organization, but we just expect all the development teams to learn about it by themselves and to understand how they should use it, that's a very high cognitive load we're putting on that team, which probably is already under pressure to deliver features, deliver the business value. So we can find a better way to deal with that. Let's not just kind of put this extra technology on top of the already existing cognitive load of these teams. So that case study or that example from Airbnb was quite interesting. And so there's this quote, right? The best part of my day is when I update 10 different YAML files to deploy one line code change. Said no one ever, right? It's not something that I know of anyone likes to do. And so this relates to that kind of cognitive load to actually deliver our code changes in this case, which is the way that development teams are usually delivering the value for the business. And so what Airbnb did was to try to make it easier for developers to deploy their services. And so what you see here is that the infrastructure team at Airbnb created a very simple command line tool called KubeGen. And what this tool does is that it knows what are the different environments that they use at Airbnb. So they have production, canary, and the dev environments. And it populates all the configuration files with kind of sensible defaults for most of this. And you see on the left side, this is what the development team now has to worry about, which is much less than if they just have to use Kubernetes directly. And so now they can focus on the things that are specific to their service and their application, and all the rest will be generated by this simple tool, and obviously then applied into the running clusters. So clarifying kind of these service boundaries and essentially raising the abstraction by using that tool and providing that kind of abstraction reduces cognitive load on the development teams. So it's important. I won't give you a lot of details around the kind of the topologies that we talk about in the book, but it's important to understand that we are talking especially here around stream-aligned teams, which what we call kind of teams with end-to-end ownership of their service or application, that they hopefully they build and run their own services. So they take feedback from their customers and from running systems into the next iterations of the service. And we're talking about platform teams. So the idea is that the platform team reduces cognitive load by abstracting away these kind of low-level details around, usually around infrastructure, around things like deployment pipelines, infrastructure provisioning, networking, monitoring, all these kind of services that most of the stream teams or development teams are going to need. But we want to reduce how much they need to know and worry about. So the stream-aligned team is perhaps if more familiar with product team terminology, and it's kind of the same idea of having this ownership in these teams of the end-to-end life cycle of their services. So another interesting case study is from USwitch. This is a rather smallish organization, around 50 people. So what they do, they're quite popular in the UK. They provide comparison website for different home services. So making easy for people to switch, for example, from one electricity provider to another one, and be able to compare the differences, etc. So, and they also have RVU, which is kind of similar but for financial services. So a couple of years ago, I found this article from Paul Ingalls, their head of engineering, around talking about convergence to Kubernetes. This article I always recommend, or often recommend, because it's a very good example of thinking about technology and teams and the flow of delivery together. So not think about these things separately, but how they are interrelated. So he had some cool graphs in that post. What happened, to give you a bit of background, is that from the beginning, when they were a startup and they were growing, and they wanted to have teams as autonomous as possible. So each team was responsible for a service, and they had basically almost full freedom to decide which services they wanted to use, infrastructure, pipelines, etc. Kind of the only constraint was to use AWS, public cloud, but that's kind of not a big constraint. Is that I don't think it's a big constraint, but they let the teams decide, how they had their own AWS accounts, they had their own decisions around which services to use, how to set them up, etc. And what this graph is showing, that over time, they saw that teams this map shows the number of calls to AWS APIs. And you see, as time goes on, there are more and more calls. And they were looking at this as kind of a proxy, kind of a way to show that this kind of autonomous stream-aligned teams are having more and more cognitive load being used around understanding AWS services, increasing their the usage of AWS. And the teams were also feeling that they were slowing down in their ability to deliver actual business value and focusing on functionality and reliability, etc. So what Paul and the organization were trying to do by adopting Kubernetes, as he says here, is not change the organization to use Kubernetes, but the other way around. In fact, they wanted to introduce the idea of a platform and a platform team in order to minimize cognitive load on their autonomous teams, on their kind of service development teams. And so they introduced Kubernetes. They started providing services around Kubernetes platform. And over time, they saw, and they were measuring like the calls that were going direct to AWS. So meaning teams that had not switch to the platform. Remember, it was not mandatory for them. And the calls that were coming in through the platform, which obviously would, they were running Kubernetes on the AWS. So obviously it was going to the same public cloud, but it was, using the abstractions of the platform. And so you can see it actually went down significantly, and the team started to basically free up cognitive capacity and effort to focus more again on the business aspects. So the purpose in general of a platform is to enable those stream-aligned teams, as we call them, or product teams, if you like, or application teams, to deliver their work as autonomously as possible, but relying on these self-service capabilities with APIs and tools that the platform provides. And the core objective, the high-level objective, is to reduce the extraneous cognitive load. So if we think about the platform and we think about developing the platform with this kind of high-level objective in mind, this helps us make certain decisions. And this was something that Paul Ingalls was talking about as well. They wanted to keep the, to scale their teams, but keep the principles of autonomy, minimal coordination, and self-service. So in other words, keep the teams that were working on business services self-sufficient, so not depending on other teams to do work for them, but minimize how much they need to know, how much of the technical stack they need to know, how much they need to worry about kind of this low-level services. So that's where the platform came in, and it helped focus more on the applications. So I talk about treating the platform as a product. This means, in particular, thinking about aspects of the platform that are not just the functionality itself, what we're providing and the capabilities that we provide, but is it reliable? Are the services reliable? Are they fit for purpose? They actually meet the needs of the stream teams? And do we have very strong developer experience, which is kind of the equivalent of user experience for development teams? So those are kind of key aspects of a successful modern platform, which is very different from that kind of black box platform of the past. Some of the things we need to consider around platform as a product or reliability is, what is the on-call support? Because now our applications depend on the platform services, for example, for monitoring, logging, etc. So the platform should have on-call as well. Make clear what are the service status at the moment. Clarify the communication channels. How does the platform team prefer to receive incident information, feedback, requests for help, etc. The response time for incidents, and also if we're having downtime perhaps or degraded service because we're updating to a new Kubernetes version, for example, then we need to understand the impact on other teams. We need to talk to them and not just decide by ourselves how we're going to do it. We also need to think about a much more agile development of platform services. It's not about going, taking requirements and going away for 3 months and then come back and here's the service that you asked for, but now turns out it's not what you need. We've all been there if you've been part of software development teams where we know this doesn't work well. We need kind of more iterative, hopefully actually prototyping, getting fast feedback from the teams around, is this what you need? Is this the kind of platform service you need? Does this cover your use cases, etc.? We want to focus on less services in the platform, but with higher quality of service, with more reliability and so on. So we need actually very strong product management inside the platform teams. Focusing on the developer experience, I mentioned, that means we need to understand what, speak the same language, so not necessarily the same programming language, but understand how the development teams, their knowledge level, where they're coming from, and how we're going to make it easier to use the platform and provide the right level of abstractions. So again, from the U-Switch example, a couple of the things that they wanted from Kubernetes was to have these application focus abstractions, but keep coordination at the minimum by kind of letting the platform team decide on how to operate and configure clusters, etc. And with the right abstraction so that the application teams or service teams didn't have to worry about that. Some of examples of services that their platform team developed was also things that were kind of usually for a single application or service. Streamline team was not worthwhile to invest, but as a platform team, they could provide this to others in a much more efficient way. So dynamic database credentials, load balancing, and also the last one was very popular. They created a very easy way to for teams to not only get alerts, but actually define their SLOs and get dashboards in a very easy way. So this is a screenshot of how these dashboards look like, and they were integrated with their chat tools. So this means an application team or Streamline team could configure actually with this kind of small configuration files. They could define their SLOs and how they for their own services, and get from the platform service, get a dashboard running like this in a very easy way with integration with their chat tool to provide alerts on, this, you went over this threshold for this SLO, etc. So that proved quite successful. Kind of the journey they took was very interesting from the moment they introduced the platform, because they were actively thinking about platform as a product and about the customers that they wanted, or that, obviously they wanted most of the teams to use the platform. But they started with the first customer that they knew this team was a little bit lagging behind in terms of things like centralized logging, metrics, auto-scaling. And so they knew if we provide services that are helpful for this team, it's a first kind of success. And so that worked out quite well. And then they started to see, because their application or Streamline teams were quite mature, most of them, they actually were a bit reluctant to adopt the platform until it kind of proved that it provided the same levels of reliability, the same similar levels of latency, response time, etc. And so the platform team itself started using SLAs and SLOs to show to the other teams, these services are, meet your criteria, your needs for your applications. And they were measuring, as I've seen before, how much traffic was going through the platform versus directly to AWS as kind of an indicator, a metric of the adoption of the platform. So it was pretty interesting. And at some point, so they had one team that was actually, there's the most mature in engineering terms, but they were also bringing in the highest revenue for the organization. And so that team was the most reluctant to adopt the platform, because they knew their kind of business value also relied on a high availability, the response time, the reliability for their kind of business service they were providing to customers was very high. And so until they had kind of proof and they could see that the platform would really meet those kind of high expectations, only then they decided to adopt the platform, because they said, okay, we have the same quality of service with the platform, and then we don't have to focus and worry around this kind of service, lower level services anymore. We can focus more of our effort on the business side. So it was like a big win for them. And remember, all of this was without mandating the platform, and was much more focused on, how do we make this platform product usable and consumable, and meeting the needs of our teams. So there are different kind of categories of metrics you can think about for a platform. They're kind of product or delivery metrics. So if you're familiar with the book Accelerate from IT Revolution Press, or the same publisher as Team Topologies, so the great work by Dr. Nicole Forsgren, researching what are the practices and also the metrics that that high-performing or elite-performing teams display and perform very well around these metrics like lead time, deployment frequency, time to restore, and change fail percentage. So you can also look at these metrics for your own platform services internally. But I would actually start, before we do that, I would start with have something in place that provides you information on the satisfaction of your internal customers, the other teams, the Streamline teams, their satisfaction with your platform. And this doesn't have to be very complicated, hard to get metrics. So, for example, Twilio, which is a company in the US, their platform team, what they do is send out a survey on a regular basis to their kind of internal customers, the teams that use the platform, with some simple questions around, does the platform help you build, deliver, and run your services? Is it compelling? Do you feel like we're listening to your feedback and improving the platform as needed to fit your needs? And so they're getting this information, which is, it's not about kind of the hard data and hard numbers. It's actually seeing if other teams feel like platform helps them, is growing in the right direction, and they can also see a trend. If from one, since the last survey, they see that teams are feeling like they're not being listened, heard, they're not being heard in terms of their needs, then perhaps platform team can realize, oh, yes, that's true. We were focusing too much on developing these new services. We kind of forgot to listen to the feedback. So it's a way to keep us in check as platform teams and drive the platform in the right direction and our behaviors as well. We also should be looking at the adoption of the platform and the engagement. So the example of USwitch, they were actually looking at kind of the platform API calls versus AWS, but you might just do something more higher level, more simpler ways, just to look at how many teams are using the platform. In this example, if we have two teams out of 5 Streamline teams using the platform. So is that good or bad? Depends. If we're just starting and it's actually pretty good to have 2 teams already, and we need to see how we are going to help the other teams and provide what they need. Or if we've had 2 out of 5 teams use the platform for 6 months, then perhaps we need to think about what we're doing here and how can you change this trend. But having some measurement is important. And finally, as you saw in USwitch example, at some point I would start with user satisfaction and adoption metrics. At some point you need to also have an idea of the reliability of the platform services. And for some teams, that might be quite important in their decision to use the platform or not. So like in the example of USwitch, they were actually using these dashboards for their own platform services to show to the other teams how they were performing. So in this slide, you have some examples of the metrics that you can use, but whatever makes sense in your context, and it doesn't have to be difficult and to get started. Remember the Twilio example, that's something very easy to set up that survey. In general, remember, success of platform teams is the success of those Streamline teams or application teams. The success of platform is to reduce cognitive load of those teams. And finally, we need to talk about team interactions. That kind of balance between who kind of owns the technology and who consumes it. So remember the Airbnb example. This was quite effective for them, and it's interesting because they don't call themselves platform teams; they call their infrastructure team. But what they were really doing, at least in this example, is kind of a platform, abstracting away kind of what's underneath and providing this very clear kind of service boundary where the development teams have to worry about a lot less than if they were using Kubernetes directly or the Kubernetes APIs directly. And this is what allows them to reduce cognitive load on the development teams, as we were talking about before. So we need strong collaboration between platform and streamline teams or development teams for any new service or evolution. Remember, we want to do this in a much more agile, modern way than kind of just going off for 3 months and working in isolation. That's not the point. So we have this collaboration for new services, but we also have, we need to also to provide support and good documentation, good usability for the services that are already stable, already have been around for a while. So we call that X as a service, where one team, in this case platform, provides a service that another team consumes without actually needing to interact on a regular basis. And it's not that the platform hides everything and that we're going to be able to abstract everything around the technology like Kubernetes, but we're making some things that are common in the workflow of the teams easy to do. But it's fine if the development teams understand what's underneath and understand Kubernetes workings. They can actually provide good feedback to the platform teams around maybe we would like to use this functionality in Kubernetes. Is there a way to have a good abstraction in the platform? Or perhaps the development team might use it first and then push it to the platform as a service. And over time, this is what we expect to see in a modern platform team is they're going to switch between collaboration, working on new services, abstractions, and providing stability to existing services. So in the case of Airbnb, they had a couple of services that were actually command line tools, kubegen and kubedeploy. And they actually then realize another common problem for our development teams is diagnosing problems with their services running in Kubernetes, because there's a lot of information they need to find, logs and runtime information, etc. So they actually, at some point, created a diagnosis tool, K-diagnose or something like that, which helped to just bring all that information together much more quickly, and therefore helping the teams diagnose and understand what the problem is. So actually, this is just a kind of funny way of highlighting. So someone created this flow chart where if you're doing, diagnosing a problem, troubleshooting Kubernetes deployments, this is kind of the flow chart of all the things you need to look at. So Airbnb did that. The infrastructure team was make this much simpler by already automating a lot of the information gathering that is needed. And so in general, kind of the pattern that we see in platform teams with application or streamline teams is that there's collaboration, strong collaboration when we're defining a new service, understanding what the development teams need here on the left. And then it starts to decrease the amount of collaboration as we get clarity on those kind of boundaries between the platform service, until we focus on stabilizing and making this service actually easy to use, reliable, and improve documentation, make sure it's easy to adopt by more teams. So that was the new service that Airbnb infrastructure team provided, K-diagnose. Another aspect that, particularly in this case around Kubernetes, is that if you are familiar with this picture, this is actually the cloud native landscape of tooling around different areas. And I like Andy Bergen, who also talks a lot about Kubernetes and runs some meetups in the UK. He calls this the toy shop for Kubernetes. So kind of there's so many choices, even for the same kind of domain like security or persistence or whatever it might be. There are so many choices. How do you kind of navigate this? And so having the platform can help. So if we have good abstractions, then perhaps we can actually underneath in the platform switch from one tool to another or replace parts of that, how that service runs, without any impact on development teams in some cases. In other cases, perhaps there's going to be an impact, and we can talk with those teams to understand, this is the benefits we would get from switching, and this is the impact. This is what you need to change in your workflow. Just helps us reason a lot more, rather than, we're the platform team, we're the owner, so we're going to make this change, and everyone else just adapt. That is not the way for a modern platform that actually accelerates the development teams. Not only kind of the all this tooling that is recognized, if you like, by the Cloud Native Foundation, but also all the open source tools and things that are available. So actually that service from USwitch to generate dashboards for SLO is actually open source. They called it Heimdall. So other organizations can use it. And so having, again, the platform helps navigate and use this kind of functionality that others have already worked on. A lot of the times we see different organizations working on the same problems and creating their own solutions rather than looking at what exists and adopting that. And the platform makes it easier to adopt and provide an internal abstraction, which is often the reason why organizations start developing their own solution, is because they have a specific need. But if we can have a good abstraction and use a third party, that reduces how much we need to do in the platform ourselves. Another example, so another company that has done a lot of open source around Kubernetes is called Zalando. I'm not sure how known they are in South America and North America, but in Europe they're quite popular. And so because they have a large infrastructure on Kubernetes, they created cluster lifecycle management tools and other tools that are quite interesting. So I'm getting to the end, so we have hopefully time for questions too. If you're getting started with this kind of team-centric view of Kubernetes adoption, or even if you don't use Kubernetes, but this kind of platform view, platform adoption from a team-centric perspective, one of the first things you can do is start assessing the cognitive load of the stream teams, of your application teams. How well do they understand the current platform and the abstractions they need to use on a regular basis? If it's quite complicated and it takes up a lot of their effort, then start there. Start identifying how can we provide better abstractions, like in the Airbnb example, to simplify the life of the development teams. Make sure you have a shared understanding of what your platform is, and also in particular, what's the gap between your Kubernetes implementation and a digital platform, as we've seen in the definition today. Identify those gaps and try to start addressing those. And finally, clarify team interactions. It's good to have clarity and not just let things happen as needed. And sometimes we think, well, we need to collaborate with everyone. Well, actually, if we have clarity on when we need to collaborate, what is the problem we're trying to solve or the solution we're trying to identify, versus when this should be stable and running as something easy to consume by others that doesn't require interaction. If we have that clarity, that really helps drive the value of the platform and reduce the confusion around interactions between different teams. And finally, some resources. There are several talks that are focused on platforms from some of these that I mentioned today as well, and others. So I recommend having a look. There's also an article published based on this presentation. So if that's helpful to share, or if you want to get kind of a more structured view from today, have a look there. I'm running a training online, public training on July 2nd, which focuses on modern platforms. So it's a half-day training. If you're interested, have a look at teamtopologies.com/events or contact me. So we look at this idea of platform as a product, and also kind of how do you transform from traditional infrastructure teams to modern platform teams with case studies and so on. So if you're interested, you can reach out to me on LinkedIn or Twitter. And I went a little bit beyond the time I wanted to spend, but thank you very much for listening. So in my name and in the name of Matthew Skelton, the co-author of the book, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Manuel, for your time and for your presentation. It was a blast. We would like to share with you one question that we have. It's from Yolanda Lopez, and her question is, as a platform team, which of the three types of cognitive load should we reduce to the teams we
Yeah.
serve?
So the main one is extraneous cognitive load, because the platform should be simplifying the workflow effectively for the application teams to deliver their work, right? So they have less to worry about. Another pattern I've seen in some organizations that the platform team might also work as what we call enabling team, essentially also helping the application teams or stream teams understand the domain of that, for example, around monitoring, not just providing the service that they can use, but actually helping them understand what are the good practices around monitoring or around continuous deployment, or whatever it is that the platform helps provides a service. The same platform team might also facilitate the knowledge and help the teams reduce the kind of intrinsic cognitive load around how do I use this service.
Nice, thank you. And I remember all of the attendees. If you have any other question, please let us know in the comment section. And I believe we have another question, which is something regarding the probably the third to last slide where you mentioned about the metrics. I mean, when you mentioned the cognitive load and measuring the cognitive load in your teams as the first step.
Yes.
Yeah, that one. So what kind of metrics can we use in order to assess the cognitive load in our teams?
That's a good question, because I forgot to include here. We actually have some repositories on GitHub. I'm not sure if you can see them now, but on github.com/team topologies, I'll include that link in the slides that I send out. So there's one around team cognitive load assessment, and it's actually just a Google form. So the point is not to be these metrics, like the user satisfaction, it's not necessarily about a specific kind of number or data. It's actually understanding how does the team feel around these services and the things they need to do to deliver their work. So this is just an example. You could have other questions, but kind of helping understand how the teams feel about building their services, deploying, testing, operating their services, being on call if they are built and run team. So we can use this to kind of not to get a specific number, but just to understand, are they feeling kind of on the low end? They're feeling like they have a lot of difficulties, for example, deploying and monitoring their services, or not? Are they feeling generally that they know and they understand enough of how to do that? So this is an example about assessing cognitive load in a kind of lightweight manner, but that will provide you insights on which teams are struggling with what aspects of their workflow.
Thank you. We also have participation of multiple people. Eddie Mendez says good vibes. Hector Perez says what competencies and preparation are required for a team in order to start using a platform like this, if the team has never used a platform before?
Right. So from the perspective of the application or streamline teams, because the platform needs to focus and the platform teams need to focus on the usability of their services, then you would expect, first of all, good documentation, right? If you think about AWS, their documentation on their services is really, top quality, right? You should be doing the same thing in your own platform. And if that means we need to hire a, technical writer, or we need people to have training around how to write good documentation, then we should do that, because that's going to lower kind of the barrier for teams to start using the platform. So documentation, making clear how the support works, around the platform services, and focusing on usability. So the developer experience. And you might, again, many platform teams don't have these skills to start with around usability, design, etc. Even if we're talking mostly around APIs and command line, there's still aspects that need to be considered to make the developer experience high, because those are the factors that are going to help the stream teams or application teams start using the platform, because we make it easier for them to understand it and to start with. And obviously you want the documentation to include examples that are easy to understand. Perhaps you want to allow teams to have a kind of a sandbox to be able to try out services in a kind of a safe manner. But also it's a lot about interaction with the teams, providing good support, responding to requests for help. So I would say all of those things are important.
Thank you. And I also have Alvin Estrada here with us as a community leader, and he also has a question. You're muted, Alvin.
Hola, Manuel. I have a question from the Kubernetes group. Someone there wanted to ask that he wants to start migrating into Kubernetes. He already worked with JavaScript technologies and some cloud services like storage and Lambdas, but he wants to know what will be the first step to start migrating his infrastructure into Kubernetes, and which technology do you recommend?
So I'm not a Kubernetes expert. So in terms of the actual technology, I'm focusing on, how do we make this usable in this kind of modern platform approach. In general, like I said, Kubernetes is not something that is easy to take just some pieces. The initial investment migration is big. So obviously, I would say for any organization to actually do not just migrate and then ask teams to use the new platform. Actually start, with kind of experimental view on, let's try this, let's run, create an environment, get the stream teams or the application teams to start using in a kind of sandbox way, or with some examples, so we start to have a better understanding of how could this work in terms of having this as our kind of foundation for a platform, because it's complicated to take. You can't just take one of the pieces of Kubernetes. So start as kind of a experiment, if you like, a pilot, if you like, where people are free to experiment, but get the application teams involved from the beginning. Don't just go on and let's do our platform and then we'll worry about how to use it. It should start from the beginning.
Nice, thank you.
Thank you. Following up with the first question from Yolanda, she says, yeah, for us, it's hard to define the boundaries, and we are a mix between enable team and a platform team. So she's just giving a following up with the first question.
Yeah.
But I believe, one of the questions that I have, it's, I don't know if you're familiar with multi-skill like teams, where you have like a DevOps engineer or a QA engineer embedded in the same development team, responsible for a particular business product or whatever.
Yeah.
How would you like address like these team topologies, like self-service, I will say, like approach?
So in fact, that's similar to what we talk about in terms of stream-aligned teams, are these cross-functional teams with multi-skills, so that the idea is that they're able to take some business domain or some business problem that is served by some service or product, and then own that and may be able to make any kind of changes and from the idea, from the request until it's actually running and being used by customers. So that's the idea of the stream-aligned teams. It doesn't necessarily have to be that you have one QA, one DevOps engineer, one backend, front end. Again, we focus on the team. Does the team have the skills it needs, whether that's everyone's a generalist and everyone can do a bit of everything, or you have some specialists and generalists. If you look at the team, then that helps you make better decisions on what the team needs, rather than expecting every team to have an expert in each kind of functional area.
Thank you very much, Manuel. So I don't know if any other attendee has another question for Manuel. We're gonna keep it open for probably 1 minute, one more minute.
And by the way, feel free to send me questions later through LinkedIn or Twitter. Always happy to answer.
Thank you, Manuel. Well, I believe there is no more questions. So thank you very much, Manuel, for taking the time to speak today at Tech Community Day. We are very pleased with your speak and your talk. Now in the next session, it's going to be automating cloud deployments with Terraform and Azure pipelines. It's coming from Devlin Duldulao. He's a senior consultant in Meta. It's going to be in English session. So just feel free to scan the QR code and it will lead you to our next session. Thanks again for joining us. It was a pleasure having Manuel with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. And also remember to join our Slack channel, where you can actually ask Manuel afterwards if you like, or if you want to ask to another speaker, they will be there. There is one more question. I don't know if you have still a little bit more time for one more question. Yeah. It's again from Hector Perez, and he says, how important is for the teams to have mature agile practices to start thinking to move to DevOps?
Yes, that's a very good question. I think for every team, it's important to have agile practices, and it's more about this mindset of iterating and making small changes. And especially since we're talking about platform teams and streamlined teams. So the development teams, we in general expect them to have those agile practices in mind. But for platform teams and other types of teams, that's also quite important. So in the book, we also talk about teams responsible for complicated subsystems. All these teams should have agile practices, because we know that it doesn't really work to just develop a big piece of functionality for weeks or months, and then at the end we realize that they're not really addressing the needs that we thought we had. And so agile practices, getting fast feedback. Platform teams have the advantage that their customers are usually internal, or other teams in the organization, so they should make the most of that and be collaborating with those teams, getting their feedback as quickly as possible to identify what is the solution that they need and reduce any kind of waste. So definitely, I would say organizations that are not even adopting agile practices at the moment, and good engineering practices like continuous delivery, test automation, etc., they probably need to start there before they actually even think about their team topologies.
Good. Thank you very much, Manuel. That was a great talk and great answers. Just a reminder that this is Tech Community Day, hosted on June the 12th, today and tomorrow, hosted by the SQL Server Community Guatemala Group, Microsoft Dev Group Covan, Docker Guatemala, and Kubernetes Guatemala. Thank you for joining us, and hope to see you in the next sessions. Bye-bye.